Diana Hall, and I'd like to take you through my journey into tile making. In 1976, I met a wonderful woman called Peggy Angus, who was an artist, a committed teacher, a socialist, and a designer. Her beliefs were that art was for all, and her ideal was art for life. And this really inspired me, and she just sort of let something out of me. The meeting of Peggy was an amazing occurrence. We had a student living in our house from Sussex University, and he was doing the Threepenny Opera at the university, and he said, why can't we bring it out at the weekend? So we said, fine. We had a barn. I filled it with straw and rang up a whole lot of friends and said, please bring a friend and come to the opera. And so some great friends brought this wonderful Peggy Angus, and she had just come back from Bali, and we had a kitchen that needed some floor tiles, and I was unable to find any interesting floor tiles. So I asked her if she was able to design some, and she said, of course. And this wonderful relationship started. Her heyday was sort of the 1950s, so the first design was geometric, and it just wasn't what. I was really disappointed. And so suddenly we decided we'd do a border of creatures from the Bear Tapestry, and that was perfect. She and I joined together to print floor tiles. She was a designer and I did the printing. She would design them and I would cut them out in a block of polystyrene, and then I used iron oxide to print with. It was then fired onto the tile, and each floor was unique. It was bespoke. People came to us and we designed tiles particularly for them. Then the guy who actually printed the first floor, my floor, went off to start a pottery in Malawi. And so he said, you can come for a weekend's course, and then he was off. So I went to Cold Ashton, near Bristol, for a weekend's course, and took it all in, and it seemed so simple. But as soon as you get home on your own, it's much more difficult. And I've got 4 small children, and I just wondered, why now? You know, they were just a bit too young, but opportunities only come once in your life. So I decided to say yes, and this is going to be it. And it was really nice. We had a small farm, and I had to work on the farm. So it was really nice to do something for myself. And coming from a farming community, I'd always wanted to do something artistic. So it was great. But I would have to work after I put the children to bed until about 3 o'clock in the morning. So one order came, I did that, and that would take me about 6 months, and then another order would come. And gradually it got larger and larger and as the children grew up. And then when they were at school all day, quite a number of jobs came, and I'd got a small business. In 1984, Lewes Museum approached me about making medieval tiles. I said, well, I don't make them today, but tomorrow I will. This posed quite a problem, but my father lived on a farm just outside Lewes, where Lewes Priory was. Tiles would have been made close by to a monastic house. Therefore, they would have used local clay. So I got some clay. A friend in Lewes carved a wooden block, and between us we made a tile, and we fired it in a friend's kiln over the other side of the river, and the the result was really quite pleasing, but I had to do more research to work out why, how the originals would have been done. In the mid-80s, I was on holiday in Scotland with my young children, and on the way home I'd heard on the news that there had been an archaeological excavation at Norton Priory, and they had found a medieval tiled floor. So I was really keen to go and see it. So I turned right, went down a motorway, and then turned left and arrived at the gates. And on the gates there was a notice for the general public, and it said that they were looking for people to come and make replica medieval tiles. And I looked even harder, and unfortunately it was the weekend before. And then the next notice asked for the general public to come and help fire a replica medieval kiln. And I just thought I just couldn't believe that I'd arrived just beforehand. But I did realise that 4 young children under the age of 10 wouldn't actually wait from Wednesday to Sunday. So I got back, and it was really before big motorways, so I had to drive home, which took me 9 hours. Arrived home and met my husband, and I just said to him, "These are your 4 children now, and I'm going back to Cheshire to fire this kiln." So I left them at home, got back into my camper van and went back up to Cheshire, and I arrived just as they were lighting the kiln. It was just a most fantastic moment, and I learnt such a lot about medieval tile making. And then I went home and started experimenting. My children went off to university in the late 80s, and one of them had wanted to do archaeology. So I sent off to Bournemouth to see what courses there were. And they wrote back about the archaeology, and they also sent some information about a new course called Heritage Conservation. And they were looking for mature students. So I thought, well, I'm a mature student, haven't ever done anything before, had no further education, so I was on a full grant. I got an unconditional place, and so I went off and spent 3 glorious years studying all those books, those fantastic tutors, had an amazing time. And as I set off to do my finals, the phone went, and the architect for Winchester Cathedral phoned up to ask whether I was able to do 1,000 tiles. The designs that I was asked to reproduce were originally made in 5038 at Otterbourne. It was very exciting. I had to make some sample tiles. I was able to look at the original clay of the tile under microscopes and to work out that it was Reading bed clay. And in Dorset they have a lot of Reading bed clay. It was interesting preparing for the job. I went in and traced the designs, and people were usually looking up at the columns and looking at the roof, and suddenly they were looking at the designs on the floor. And so people used to stop and talk and discuss what we were doing, which was interesting. So I was able to get local clay, and John, my partner, carved the wooden blocks. The cathedral wanted to move a tomb to allow greater access for the general public to walk through the retrochoir. The difficulty with replacing tiles is that new tile has a glaze on it and is glossy, and the old tiles are very well worn. I take a certain amount of clay and wedge it to get rid of the air bubbles, to get the fibres going in the same direction. And then I leave it to sour for about 24 hours. And leaving it to sour also helps the knitting of the fibres together. So this helps the risk of warping, because the last thing I want is for my tiles to warp. So after 24 hours, I take my piece of clay, knock it into a square, to put it into the mould. Now, previous to this, I have done a shrinkage test, because we need to know the shrinkage to make the wooden stamp 8% larger than the original tile. So I fill the mould with the clay, right into all the corners, very important. I take my stamp, and this is a design from Winchester Cathedral. I place it on top, turn it over, to knock the clay into the stamp, and to try and avoid any air bubbles. And then I knock it very good for Monday morning. At this stage, I put keyholes into the back, and the keyholes help to keep it flat and help it to key into the mortar when the tiles are laid. I also put a goose, my mark, into the back, so in later years people know that I've made it rather than a medieval man. Then I peel the tile off the stamp, and you get the indentation of the stamp. And then I'm going to fill that with a slip. The slip I've had to experiment with to get the right consistency. I found this recipe in William Furnival's leadless glazes, and it means that you have a little bit of the back base clay mixed in with the slip, and it's got to shrink together so that it doesn't, after firing, it doesn't jump out. So this is my slip. And here it's very important to get it into all the corners and not to have any air bubbles. It's when you cut it back in a later process, the actual surface is ruined, so it's a waste of your work. So it's very important to get rid of the air. So now the tile is left for about 3 days for the slip and the base red clay to draw together. This tile I made 3 days ago. It's just the right dryness, it cuts back easily and you get the clear definitions. And this feels pretty good. I put chamfers on the sides so that when it's being laid, this grout comes up through to hold the tiles together securely. The tile's now left for a month to dry, because if the moisture stays trapped inside, when it goes into the kiln, it expands and then bursts the tile. So after a month, it's then glazed with a lead glaze, a galena glaze, that's been mixed with Guinness to make it stick to the dry clay. And then it comes out with a lovely honey glaze.
This is a low-res print of a piece of Irish lace of a picture of Limerick Castle, and I wanted to turn that into a tile, and the design is very adaptable for a two-colour tile. So what I've done is, on this piece of beech, I've drawn the picture of the castle from this, and now I'm starting to rough out the background, and then I will start doing the detail and then finally clear everything up. The inlay is only about 2mm deep, so you can see the depth that I'm carving to, and it takes a fair bit of time, because first of all you've got to go around with the chisel and outline things, reduce it down to the depth, and then finally clean it up so it's all at an even depth, and then all the detail has to be put in. For a lot of operations I use conventional wood carving tools, gouges and flat tools, flat chisels, and but because of the nature of this mould making, it's not quite the same as conventional wood carving. I have to make up special tools for various operations, some of them just small tools because they're not readily available, and I have little flat fine chisels for going along the bottom of fine grooves, and it's tapered so that when the clay goes in there it helps the white clay stick to the sides of the red clay.
Well, the medieval tiles have been made by man, and the whole thing about them is they exude passion as well. They're very individual. Each one is different, and they tell you about the person who's made them. When the Industrial Revolution came and presses were made, they suddenly started reproducing thousands, and they lost that passion. I think it's the machinery is just staggering that they made, but the actual tile, I just love that medieval man has made and had to work really hard to produce a beautiful thing. I have a concern now that the research that I've done will be lost again, and we will then have to reinvent the wheel. I've spent time looking at the different types of clay. I've spent time looking at the wood for the stamp. I've looked at how different stamps were made, and different tiles were made in different parts of the country. And unless I write a book, make a video, all this work is going to be lost, because I have no youngster coming up behind me interested. Very difficult to make enough money because it's time consuming. Every process takes time, and nobody really is prepared to pay for this. So I'm passionate to tell you about the way that medieval tile, my journey through medieval tile making.